Hi everybody, it's Jazz here. I want to make this video as to how you can best prepare for any abroad trip where you're going to be in a foreign country, and I'm going to share all that I know. First of all, it is December 2023 by the time this is being filmed. And so I recently, as of last week, got back from a trip to Canada. I went to visit some friends who were in Toronto, like in the just outside of Toronto, and then also another one who lived in another city that's like in and around Montreal. So these are two completely different provinces, for the most part, Ontario and then Quebec. And I was really excited about it because I could really be able to see what Canada's like for the first time. Never been before. And I was very glad that I went with a few friends who I had met. Actually, originally met them virtually through an entrepreneurial group or collective for women, and that has since dissolved since then. But we still have remained in contact. And we are still very actively, we're actively friends. So anyway, I wanted to kind of give you some things that you should really think about when you're going to a country where they may speak a different language than you. Because I know Ontario, most of Canada, they all speak English, but especially Quebec is very different because they are a French-speaking province. Okay, so I want to give you like some proper research, of what things you can expect. So really, when you're learning about this particular place, of course, like if you're visiting, it's one thing, but also it's really helpful to understand like economic, political, and even social aspects of any country that you're visiting, because it just helps, especially like if people are talking about certain things and you have no idea what they're talking about. Like they were talking about the strikes for like a lot of public workers, I think including teachers. I actually did some research because I actually was watching the news because I found this station. It's called Radio Canada, but they actually do news like on air, like video. So I did look into that to see what's going on. So when people are talking about things, it's not like, oh, I don't know anything about that, So it just really helps. And then also, it just overall helps you understand these topics, so you can ask local or friends when conversing about it, because if you are familiar with those topics, you can actually ask better questions about just living there. Also, climate, researching the climate, like typical weather patterns. Like I know that when we drove from Toronto all the way to Montreal, the temperature was night and day. It's like here in Kentucky, when it's December, it's usually pretty chilly. It's like maybe about 0, maybe -3 degrees Celsius. I don't know what that is in Fahrenheit. Which is like pretty much like you just wear a coat. But when we started driving into Montreal, it was like -7, -8, -9. Like it was snow everywhere. We didn't, so. And my friend from Toronto, she doesn't like the snow. So that's just kind of a thing to make sure knowing that, like if you're going to different, like multiple places, you do have to understand that the weather is going to be different in terms of what you bring. I brought basically one big winter coat, and that's all that I needed. I had some gloves. I had a hat, of course, a scarf. So I had like basically the full thing. And that's what I wore to the airport, because it gets cold in the airplane. But anyway, just being able to know, especially just being able to know like how you're gonna be able to adapt to the cold or hot weather depending on where you are. So that's just something to keep in mind. Also, like if there is, so this is moving on more so to language. So if you're going to be, let's say for me, I speak French, but I am not familiar with the Québécois. That accent and that dialect are different, and I expect it to be, because in the francophonie, like the French-speaking world, no one speaks French the same. Even in France, they speak French differently depending on where in that country you are. So depending on where you are, you have to understand that, yes, I learned French in high school, but I'm going to tell you right now, Québécois is like completely different than any other French I've ever learned, because they're separated from France by a whole continent. So their dialect is just basically like a diaspora, and they're trying to really preserve that language. So, and understanding that. So I actually ended up finding as many things as I could because I used my VPN. And I basically used that to find resources like news outlets, things I can use to get exposed to that dialect. Because I feel like sometimes when people think, oh, I'm going to go to Quebec, I'm going to learn, I'm going to try to learn French prior to, and then they go to Duolingo, or they go to things like Babbel, or maybe I'm trying to think of other apps. But anyway, they go to these generic language learning apps, and I'm going to tell you right now, that's not going to help you. Because I remember when we were actually at dinner on, I want to say Friday night in Quebec, in Montreal, and we were all like meeting each other because we all have like mutual friends that we met up with, and one of them, she doesn't really speak a whole lot of English, but her accent was just something I had never heard before. It took me aback. I was like, whoa, hold on. And so my other friend, who's from Quebec, she had to kind of, in her own French, because her accent is pretty standard, it's a little bit easier to understand. And also she was an au pair in France as well. So it kind of helps in that sense. And so it was like she would say something, and then my friend would kind of help translate from her accent, from her very deep Quebec accent to standard accent. It's like I could understand French, so she had to just kind of reiterate. And then it didn't help that the restaurant was loud. So I'm going to tell you right now, when you learn things for Duolingo, it's going to give you a basic understanding of like the language itself and how the language is structured and whatnot, but it's not going to prepare you for the fact that people don't speak that way. So I always find it so funny when people are like, yeah, I'm doing the Duolingo. No, don't do the Duolingo. I mean, it's a great start, but I'm going to tell you right now, if you got to make sure you're getting familiar with the accent. Finding content that involves like maybe news outlets, or maybe finding YouTubers. I learned everything on YouTube. There are people, probably you can find people on TikTok if that's your thing. I am not on TikTok personally, but YouTube, I've learned everything off of YouTube. So, I do love long form content. There are people who actually do like videos, or who do, all kinds of social media content that are just saying like, hey, here's the difference between French and Quebecois. There's a lot of people who do those kinds of things. There may be even people who do difference between French from France and Belgium. People do it all the time. And it's a way to really be able to understand those nuances, because they're going to freak you. They might freak you out if you're not familiar with that. You're like, oh, I did Duolingo. It doesn't mean anything because the accents. One of my friends, she asked me if I wanted more wine, or to try her wine or something like that. And I said, okay, yeah, sure. So then when she pours it, and I'm like, that's enough. I say, ça suffit. And that basically means that's enough. And she looks at me and she's like, oh, ça suffit. That's so funny. I'm like, what do you mean? It's like, we just say merci. Like, we don't really say like, you don't say that. I'm like, oh, okay. So there's like a lot of things I realized that I had learned that are not really the same thing. So it's like, oh, you don't call it that. So especially like if you're traveling with people who are native speakers, or they're natives to that land, they may give you a much more nuanced perspective, like saying, no, we don't say that, we say this, that kind of thing. So, but overall, it really, really helps to get access to that content, listening to music and things like that, just so you're familiar with it. You want to train your brain to get familiar with that language, so that when you hear it, it's not like I got to translate in my head. It's like, oh, I've heard that before. And you kind of associate certain words or certain phrases or certain things with what I don't recommend teaching. I don't teach words and phrases, but still, like, sometimes it helps, like when someone says something, there are at least key words that you can pick out. And also, if you're familiar with the accent, then it also makes it easier for you to kind of like get through the accent to be able to understand. Because I remember, even though that person, her accent took me aback, I was like, whoa, I wasn't expecting that. But at the same time, after a while, I kind of got used to it, because I had already prior to had been exposed to it. And then when I actually spoke to her in real time, it was like, yeah, of course, it was thick. It was a very thick Quebecois accent, but I still could figure out what she's trying to say based on just listening. And you have to listen to what the words are. So sometimes people get so focused on the the accent itself, and they don't realize like, hey, like there are a lot of words that she's saying that you do know. Like, don't feel insecure, because at the end of the day, you know the language. It's just that, again, accents and how people pronounce words can sometimes throw people off. So it's not that you don't know the language. It's just that, again, this is a learning experience, and you're getting familiar with this accent. So let's say you decide to come back again, you're kind of still familiar. You're already familiar. You're already exposed to it. There's this, you kind of get a sense of like getting past certain stereotypes, because I know that like with Canadians, a big stereotype is they're friendly, which can be true. I mean, I'm being honest with you. That is true from my experience with natives, but I want to say that I learned that in Toronto traffic, they are not very nice. It's like we're trying to get our Starbucks because she wanted to get some caffeine before we drove all the way out to Montreal, and we see someone flashing their lights, and we're like, hey, like, if I pay for my Starbucks, I'd like to get it first. It's like, hey, hold on, I haven't gotten my stuff, and you're already flashing. And I had my friend on the way, she said, look, this little car is flashing its lights at this big truck in the passing lane. And so then she's like, okay, that guy's going to get really pissed off. So what's going to happen is he's not going to move. This guy is going to get frustrated. And then there was another truck on the other lane. She's like, okay, so they're gonna pass this truck over here, and then all of a sudden, like, as this little car is trying to move over, the truck is gonna move over too, and just to piss it off. And that's exactly what happened, and we passed them both. And I was like, whoa. He's like, yeah, people, they have zero patience on the road, and every 5 minutes she's like, this person is on my tail. It's like, leave me alone. So again, people in Toronto are friendly, but not when it comes to traffic. And having lived in LA, I understand that, because traffic it's a whole nother world. It's a whole other thing. It's like, I think it's just kind of like something that's universally known, that traffic sucks and everybody hates it because everybody wants to get somewhere. So the other thing is that, like, cultural wise, is that you understand, you kind of understand the dynamics politically, because I remember telling my friend, I'm like, yeah, like, Canada seems like a place I would want to live. I always think that every time I think about that as a consideration every time I travel, like, would this be somewhere I would want to stay long term, at one point, because I'm a global citizen. I don't really believe that I'm bound to one particular place. Like, even though I'm from Kentucky, I don't feel obligated to live in Kentucky until the day I die, So when you have that kind of aspects, it's like, learning from them, okay, actually, no, we're trying to leave Ontario, because it's like, instead it was like grounds for like a monopoly, and there's a lot of these things that were going on, and you kind of get like, again, these are perspectives you're not going to get from like a tour guide who's running around with like a little smiley face umbrella telling you to go to the next spot. No, these are real people, and they're going to give you like more nuanced perspective. So if you're like, yeah, I'd love to move to Canada, talk to a Canadian, talk to someone who's from there, because they can give you a real perspective versus a tour guide who you're paying to tour you around the city. So that makes a really big difference. Like, asking things about, like, looking at things like cost of living, like with exchange rate. So like, specifically with Canada, like, the Canadian dollar is currently, at this moment that I'm filming this, it is 74 cents to every US dollar. So things are relatively cheap, but it kind of evens out. So in that sense, you're kind of understanding like how much money you're going to be spending, or what it's going to be like. With your, like, for me, I was there for 4 days. And relatively everything was really cheap, I will say. I mean, based on some of the restaurants we went to, I was like, well, this is really affordable. And the other thing that throws you off is that they use the dollar sign. But they use it after the number, not before, like we use in the US. So it's kind of like understanding that even though like certain countries, they use the same currency symbol, but it's not the same currency. Just, it's like, I remember when I was in Mexico, they used the dollar sign too. And I was like, $50 for a coffee? And it's like, no, it's 50 pesos, but they're using the dollar sign. And that's basically like $2 and something. So it's a change, something like that. So you kind of get the sense of, like how things are written That's another thing, because you want to be able to read. Reading things makes sense, and kind of understanding how things are written and how things are structured. You know, I will just say is that in Quebec, I have understood from friends that I know from my friend who lives in Bromont, is that Quebec is a very French first province. That's their main thing, because they want to preserve that language. So you have French first, which means that I was actually talking to someone in my Italian class about this, because he said that he went before, and it's like, he says they give you a French menu and they speak to you in French, and then it's like, hey, he's like, hey, I don't speak French, and they're like, oh, okay, English. So it's like French is going to be number one, what they're going to give you, and it's because, again, they're trying to preserve the language, and it's like all the traffic signs, everything is all in French. Because my friend was saying when she drove into Quebec, it's like yeah, like the signs are in French and English, but then when you get to Quebec, it's like everything's in French. It's like, you got to figure it out. So it's like you're kind of screwed if you're driving and you don't know the language. So it was at a point where I was like, okay, Jazz, I'm going to need you to pay attention so I can figure out what these signs mean. So in those particular moments, that's when it's really prevalent to know the language, or at least know how to read signs. So it's like you don't, especially if you're driving into these countries, like whether it be like you're going to a foreign country and you're like, I'm going to rent a car. Can you read the signs? You know what they mean? And a lot of times, like traffic signs, especially like in Europe, and I also noticed the same thing in Quebec, is that a lot of times they're just pictures. So if you kind of know what those mean, then you pretty much are good to go. And a lot of them are pretty standard. So that's the other thing. If you're driving, you want to make sure you at least understand what road signs are going to look like, and then what traffic is going to look like. So like I was talking about earlier. So I don't know. I think it's kind of funny, because I feel like the Québécois are just as chauvin as the French are. The only thing is that the French, they're really chauvin, and chauvin is like a term to say like someone who thinks that like their language is like the only language that matters. I think in a way they're just as chauvin, because like in France they're mostly considered chauvin because they feel like their language is like above all. Like the French from France is overall superior to the other French-speaking countries. But then Quebec can sometimes seem like they're chauvin because they're kind of like, we only speak French. Like my boss, her friend, she was telling me that her friend actually has a condo in Mont-Tremblant, which is about like an hour or so north of Montreal. And she said that her friend wanted to participate in a homeowners association meeting, and she wanted to contribute, like to interject or to say something, and she said it in English, and it was like français, even though they all speak English. Still, it's, again, the policy is French first. So it's like, that's the one thing to have to kind of get used to. So, but anyway, overall, I really enjoyed my experience, and I think that I would definitely go back. And I was told to really, if I really wanted to explore like different dialects, I could even go out into, I think they were called like explore the Acadian dialect, which is a form of French, because the Acadians were part of Canada basically before France left the colonies. So it's like further on the east, in the New Brunswick, in that area. So it'd be interesting to actually explore, because I really like the idea of learning how different accents and dialects work and what they sound like. So, well, it makes my experience much more enjoyable as a linguist. So anyway, thank you so much for watching, and I really hope this helps you kind of get a sense of what to really expect, what you really would need to focus on as you're going to a foreign country. So, all right, bye.